For the next 3 weeks, we are going to be looking at the story from Luke 15 that is often called the prodigal son. I would suggest that that's probably not the most accurate name for the story, and you'll hear a little bit more about that as we work our way through this sermon series. Actually, probably the better title of it is The Two Sons and the Prodigal Father. That word prodigal literally means recklessly spendthrift, recklessly extravagant. And as we work our way through the next 3 weeks of taking this look at the older son, the younger son, and the father, I hope that you will see and understand the extravagance, the reckless extravagance that God has for his children. How God spares nothing so we might have life and have life abundant. So as we do that, we're going to read from Luke 15, the first 2 verses, and I want to do that because you need to understand the context in which Jesus speaks this parable. There are Pharisees and religious leaders present, and there are sinners and tax collectors present. He tells this story, and he points at both people as he tells this story. The Pharisees and tax collectors are the older brother, who we're going to talk about next week. The sinners and tax collectors are the younger brother, who we're going to talk about this week. But Jesus, again, as he always does, is trying to pull everyone together and help them hear the truth of his message. So we're going to be in Luke 15. If you know the chapter of Luke, if you know Luke 15, it's a story of things that get lost. There's the lost sheep, there's the lost coin, and then there's the 2 lost sons. So this is Luke 15, verses 1 and 2, to give you the context. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So that's our context. Now we pick up in verse 11. Jesus continued after telling the first 2 parables. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So the father divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." The request of the younger son is bold, brash, completely against any cultural norm that would have been anticipated as Jesus tells this story. When this younger son asks for his share of the estate or his share of the inheritance, he is basically saying to his father, "You are as good as dead to me." Because if he wants to receive that inheritance, if he wants to receive his share, the father would have to be dead. I mean, that's the way the things worked back then. And amazingly, the father does not turn him away. The father does not kick him out of the house. The father does not say, "Get lost and get out of my face." He gives it to him. He breaks up his estate. He divides, as verse 12 says, he divides his property. Now, the word that's used there for property is an interesting word. It's the word bios. So there are a couple words in the Greek language that are used for life. Zoe, which is life, But bios also has to do with a life or a lifestyle or how life has been treating you. And so when Jesus is telling this story and when Luke writes out this story and he says he divided his property, he literally is saying he's dividing his life. He's giving this younger son of his a part of him. And the younger son, as we will also see with the older son, breaks the heart of the father in asking for his share of the inheritance. As Jesus is telling the story and saying, do you understand what the father is doing? He is cutting out literally a piece of him. It's not just his property, it is his very life. And the reality of the stories of the two sons, the prodigal son, as we often talk about, who goes away and squanders everything, the older son who stays at home and sits by the father's side, is both of them do not know how to find rest in God, do not know how to find rest in Jesus, do not know ultimately how to find rest in their father. And their love, St. Augustine wrote about this. So St. Augustine, some of you may remember this famous quote. I'll put it up on the screen right now. I may as well just throw it up there because you all may have recognized this. You probably remember for sure I used this in worship a couple of weeks ago to start this worship service. Everybody remember that? Those of you at 10:15, I know I didn't start the service with that, but I alluded to this as well. But it's such a great reminder. And St. Augustine would say, you have made us for yourself, O Lord. And our heart is restless until it finds rest in you. In Augustine's Confessions, he writes about disordered loves. Now, if you know anything about St. Augustine, he was pretty successful. He was very wealthy. He had just about anything that he ever wanted. He, was popular. He had everything that the world would say was important for a person to have. He had all of it. And guess what he said? I was still miserable. He said, until I met Jesus, I was restless. I felt as though life did not make sense. And then when he met Jesus, everything changed. And so as he writes the Confessions, he talks about this idea of how we have these loves, but they are disordered. And it's not so much that we just love the sinful things, though sometimes we do love the wrong things. He says we misalign, we don't organize correctly our loves. And at the very forefront of all that, he argues that we must put God first. And if we don't, that's where this quote comes from in the beginning of the Confessions, our hearts are restless. We're not at peace. The younger son thought that if he had all this wealth, all this affluence, all this influence even, then all would be well. But as he discovers, that is simply not the case. Our hearts are restless. We're not much different than the younger son. We often go after the wrong things. We put our hope in the wrong things. And we're restless. We are dissatisfied. And what happens then with this younger son is in the midst of his dissatisfaction, in the midst of everything that is not going right, in the midst of the famine, in the midst of feeding the pigs, in the midst of all these sorts of things, he comes to his senses and says, I'm going to go back home. And this is an important message for us. Because in the midst of losing his way, in the midst of being recklessly extravagant, the prodigal in one sense, he realizes that none of that is satisfied. Like none of that is fulfilling. And he comes to his senses. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. But here's the deal. He's lost. He's very lost in the midst of his own depravity. But the good thing is this: he remembers how to get home. He remembers the love of a father. And there may be some of us in this room today who feel as though they have lost their way. Well, you feel as though you have lost your way. You may have stormed out on God. You may have yelled and screamed at God. You may have walked away from God. You may, as often happens with a lot of folks, you just slowly drift away from God. And all of a sudden you look up and you think, where the heck am I? What is happening around me? And I want you to hear clearly this morning that you can always find your way back to God. And God never, ever severs his relationship with you. That is this part of the story of the younger brother that is so important to hear. The father had every right to say to that son of his, we're done. I don't want you back. I don't want to be in relationship with you. I don't want to hear your name ever again. That was his right. And yet the Father doesn't do that. Neither does God do that with you or with me. He takes whatever it is that we bring to him, and he still loves us. He will not sever that relationship. Now, Luke 15 is interesting, and we're not going to go through all of it today because there's just not the time to do that. But if you consider those first two parables that show up in Luke 15, the lost sheep and the lost coin, the shepherd is actively looking for the lost sheep. The woman is actively looking for the lost coin. They're scattering things. They're being reckless. They're doing whatever it takes in order to find that which has gone missing. But in the story of the younger son, the father is not out there frantically searching for his lost son, but he is waiting. And he's looking out, hoping for that day when he will see his son on the horizon. And he waits, just as he waits on us. Because sometimes we lose our way. Sometimes we go in the wrong direction. Sometimes we turn our back on God out of anger, sadness, frustration, loss. But God continues to wait and to look forward to our return. He longs to grant us the rest that St. Augustine talked about. Psalm 116, verses 5 through 7. We read this: The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. And then this line: Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. Return to your place of rest, because God has been good to you. And as that younger son returns to the father runs out and embraces him. He gets on his level. He doesn't make the son grovel. He doesn't chew out the son. Boy, if you want to read a lesson in a story about mercy and grace, this is it, my friends, because he had every right to be judgmental. He had every right to judge, have certain harsh demands. He had none of that. The God that we serve, the God who calls us by name, the God who sends in his son, Jesus Christ, is the God who also welcomes us and greets us and walks out to us and meets us where we are. I was listening to something the other day. This is the problem of podcasts and listening to way too many things and still being jet lagged from being in Europe. Like there's all these images going on. And I don't know who told this story or where I even heard it, but it has stuck with me. And this woman is describing how she would have like these seizures or have these fits, and she ends up on the ground, basically on the ground. And she would say, people would come alongside, and I'm laying on the ground and I can't get up, and they would come along and they say, let me help you up, let me help you up, let me help you up. And she said, you know what I really wanted? I wanted somebody to lay it down on the ground with me and just look me eye to eye and say, it's going to be okay. And I thought, wow, that's some pretty good pastoral advice right there. That's what the Father is doing. He's getting down on the when you talk to your kids, if you got young kids, you got to get down and look at them eye to eye. And that image has stuck with me, saying how often I'm like, get up, let's get up, let's get up. It's going to be okay, let's get up. And she's like, all I really wanted was somebody just to lay down on the ground and say, I'm here with you. My friends, that is the God that we are talking about today. The God who meets us in our brokenness. The God who cares for us when we go missing. And the God who longs for us to return. He wants to transform and change your life. The Apostle Paul writes about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 17 through 21. And here's what he says as we go out to meet the Father, as we go out and encounter the love of Jesus. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new life is here. All this from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us, now notice this turns to us, the ministry of the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. And then this line, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. As Paul's writing this, he's saying, your life is transformed because of the love of Jesus. Because of this encounter with the living God, you will never be the same. And then he says, this message of reconciliation of what God has done for you is also the message that you are to carry out into this world. This is to be a part of your story. This is to be a part of your narrative. That you have been raised to new life. That something happens when you trust your life to Jesus. And as I said very, very, very early in this sermon, this is a message for all of us. This was the why for Simon Peter. All who call on the name of Christ will be saved, will be transformed, will be reconciled to God, so that you might then go and be reconciled to others. Your story matters. When you've been lost, when you've been found, when you've been strayed away, every story matters. So some of you are aware, the past couple of years, my wife and I collaborate on interactive art projects for the church that tie into my sermons so that we can kind of all participate and create something, regardless of how creative or non-creative you are, okay? I'm living proof of a non-creative. But fortunately, I married a creative. And so I have been learning about this. So we were in Stockholm after we went to Iceland. Shannon and I were in Stockholm and walking through these museums because she draws inspiration from museums. I'm not sure everyone in the room draws inspiration from museums. I have learned to draw inspiration from museums. And we're talking about like, what are we going to do? And what's the art project going to be? And we're walking through this modern museum in Stockholm. And as a good museum would have, like, she's seeing things and looking at things and creating things in her mind. And then they have this sketch room in this museum in Stockholm. And she's like, I've got it. And I'm like, you got what? Like, what do you have? She's like, we're going into the sketch room. And so she like goes, we're going to create this sort of tapestry mosaic thing. And she's drawing all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, could you do it in color? Like, it's just in black and white and pencil. And that didn't work, anyway. And I'm watching. And I'm like, I see what you're going to do. This is going to be, so here's the plan for today, because we're going to have, as Chad alluded to, we're going to have breakfast burritos for everybody, but we're also going to do 2 interactive art projects, one today and one in a couple of weeks, and ask you to participate in that. And in doing that, think about your own story, because all of our stories, God's story is about all of our stories coming together and really weaving this tapestry and this mosaic of what it looks like to actually do life together. So I have a picture of what we're going to do. It's a little small, right? So what you may or may not be able to see, depending on how your eyesight is there are all sorts of lines already in there, and you can see from there, we've already started this mosaic. This is with acrylic pens. It is foolproof because I actually colored 3 of those things that are 3 of those shapes that are up there. Thank you, Abe. Abe is giving me a hand. Anyone can do this, but we want you all to participate because we're going to create these 3 canvases of our mosaic, and then we're going to hang it in our art gallery. And you're going to be able to see how all of these colors, how all of these lives, how all of our questions, how all of our uncertainties, how it all comes together and creates this beautiful piece of art. So that's going to happen. Don't go yet. I know you're all very excited to jump up right now and start coloring. If you color outside the lines, come find me. I'll show you how to fix it, because I learned how to do that last night when I went a little bit outside the line. It's not paintbrushes, okay? So that's what's scary, because you're going to hear the word, it's pens. It's completely, I'll just leave it there, okay? So we'd love to have you participate in that. But it's a part of us telling the story. So here's what we're going to do. I've got 2 questions for you. I got one more point to make, and then we're going to wrap up this morning. The first question is actually not a question, but if you've been here for a while, or you're new to us, whatever, I always give you a couple things to think about as you walk out of church on Sunday morning. First one is this: ask someone about their story. The one thing I noticed, people love to tell their stories. No one's ever offended about, hey, tell me a little bit of your story. And then no one ever goes, I'm not going to tell you my story. You might just start this morning. You can knock that one out this morning. All right? Like if you're like, I got to knock these questions out. That one you can take care of this morning. Go out in the courtyard, grab some coffee, a scone, a breakfast burrito, and have someone tell you their story. Second one is this: is there a place in your life where things might feel disordered and they need to be reordered? What's feeling not quite right? What needs to be reordered? I want to wrap up with one more thing. I want to go back to the story of the younger son. I want to look at the 15th chapter. I want to look at the 18th verse. When the younger son comes to his senses, this is what we read. In the 18th verse, he says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and sinned against you. I want you to notice that 3rd and 4th word there, set out. It can also be translated, get up. More notably, it's translated, resurrected. When it talks about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it is the exact same wording as I will set out. I will get up. As that younger son encounters the father, he thought he was just getting up to go and see his dad. He had no idea of what the Father was going to do for him. It's the same thing that God wants to do for you. That as you set out, as you get up, as you move toward Jesus, what is it that Jesus wants to do for you? He wants to raise you up to new life. He wants to transform every part of you so you might grow into the likeness of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. Pray with me, please. God, for this morning, we say thank you for the chance to gather in your house, your place, your space, to worship, to sing, to reflect on your word. God, thank you that you are a God who wants to be a part of our story. Thank you for your forgiveness. And Lord, perhaps for some of us in this room this morning, there are some of us who have walked away. There are some who have turned their back. There are some who have stumbled and fallen. There are some who have perhaps just drifted away. And God, would you remind us of the greatness of this story, that even as the younger son stands up, even as he gets up, even as he sets out, that's the process of resurrection, new life being offered. Because as he makes his way and he meets the Father, Lord, it is us like making our way and meeting Jesus, who then raises us to something new, who helps us to reorder our lives. So God, thank you for your incredible love that has been shown through Jesus Christ. We offer this prayer in his holy name. Amen.